Shoulder ropes? Did you have a napier like Donna?
No.
Oh, I would.
Hi, everybody. Before we get started, I just wanted I wanted to welcome those of you who are not from Ropes and Gray to Ropes and Gray, and thank those of you from here for being here also. We are just delighted to be able to host this training. It is, VLP is a long-term partner of ours. We enjoy so much working with the staff and the lawyers at that organization, so it's a pleasure to host. And we also have a special interest in cultural competency here at the firm, and we've undertaken a series of trainings, and we're looking forward to learning more and more in depth from you today. So let me turn you over to Mariah Nelson to get us started.
So I'm just going to introduce our speaker for today. Leonor Figueroa-Feher is the training manager at the Office of Court Interpreter Services at the Office of the Trial Court. She was born and raised in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and she holds a PhD in Arts and Sciences from Harvard University with a concentration in Latin American literature, and a BA from the University of Puerto Rico in Arts and Sciences with a concentration in comparative literature. She's worked as a Spanish interpreter and is state and federally certified. And she's been a wonderful collaborator with VLP, and she's very passionate about providing quality services to limited English proficient individuals across the Commonwealth. So, welcome. Thank you so much, Leonor.
Thank you, Maybe I should start here. Ready? Okay. Hello to everybody here. I hear that there are more people still coming in. So everybody hears me well?
Yes.
Already. So it's a pleasure to be here. Mariah and Veronica continue to bring me to have these meetings with you guys, which I have appreciated so much. When I first came to the Volunteers Lawyers Project, I had never been really in contact with legal services associations that did not work with interpreters from the court. So my experience was really working with the court system. And I first came in with this baton of standards and parameters and ethics. And then I realized that many of you are working in departments and organizations where you work with these other interpreters that, let's call them ad hoc for lack of better term, so people who are bilingual and who act and serve as interpreters. Some of them have no training whatsoever, some of them have some training. But what started to come out from my conversations with Veronica was that there were some misunderstandings about the role of the interpreter. So here's what I want to do today. And let me see if I can figure out the wonderful technology here. That is going to be quite easy compared to everything that I've worked with before. Here's what I would like us to do today. First of all, I want to talk to you about what are the standards of practice for professionally trained court interpreters, so that you understand that and you see what is the parameter and why. And then also I want to address working with these ad hoc interpreters for two reasons. One, so that you are better equipped to monitor the situation and to improve the situation. And second, so that you know when there's that red light inside of your head telling you, I should not work with this person. There's something wrong here. So I better move out or eliminate, replace this person with someone else. So that sounds about right? And the one thing, and I have incorporated into the slides some moments where I say, let's talk. But at any time, what I would ask you is, if you have in mind some incidents, scenarios, experiences where you have felt that there has been a miscommunication, a breakdown, a problem, please share it with us, because then we can work around that as well. And I have two short videos that I think you'll enjoy. And I don't think I need to be. Would you hear me like this? You hear me? Yeah, I'll be here first. Okay. So
Leonor,
yes.
Because of the video, we need you at the podium.
Oh,
you're on
sorry,
camera.
Sorry.
Sorry
about that. Okay.
Back and front.
Okay. How about that? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good. So, let's go. Again, how can attorneys monitor proficiency, impartiality, and confidentiality? Signs that should tell you, don't use this person, and who should never be used as an interpreter. And just to mention this right off the bat, these are the two mandates that the court system is based on in terms of providing interpreters. There's Title VI of the Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination on the basis of national origin, including language, of course, and Chapter 221C of MGL, which is the law that created the Office of Court Interpreter Services where I work. What did I do? Okay. It's the next one. Okay. Working with interpreters. Let's go. Has anybody seen this pyramid before? Of course, Mariah. And before I go on, has anybody here never worked with an interpreter? Never, ever. Okay, never at all. Not even one of these ad hocs, like people who will serve as an interpreter for the moment?
Oh, I've worked with friends and family members.
Okay.
Never a real court interpreter.
Okay, all right, okay, good, that's good to know. Okay, so this pyramid is what is used more often, and especially around the medical interpreter circles, to represent what are the roles, or what is the role of an interpreter when it comes to advocacy and intervention. So the lower tier is the chunkier one, which is the role of the conduit. That is the default role of interpreters. And in that role, the interpreter simply relays a message in the other language. So the interpreter is an impartial, direct language bridge, period. The next level up of the clarifier is relates to when the interpreter finds what is called a breakdown in communication. So you are communicating with your LEP, Limited English Proficient Client, LEP client, and you find yourself getting strange answers, and something is not working right, and suddenly the interpreter steps in and says, counsel, the problem here is that the term that you're using refers to something completely different in his or her culture, something like that, no? And that breakdown in communication is resolved that way. Then the interpreter comes back to the conduit role. Culture broker is a term that is used mostly for medical interpreters and community interpreters. That's when the interpreter steps in to explain something about the person's culture that the interpreter feels is going to resolve a miscommunication. That particular tier there is a no-no for court interpreters, except for very, very exceptional situations. And we'll talk about that later and why. I personally am very careful about that one, and I don't encourage our new interpreters to enter that role. And the role of the advocate, even less. So in court interpreters, legal interpreters should never be advocates. Medical interpreters are, sometimes because, in the medical world, everybody is there ensuring the benefit of the patient. And that's not what is happening in court. No, not everybody is interested in the benefit of any one party. So here it is. And in your handout, you have a couple of let's say lists, if you will, of things to do and not to do with interpreters, including the 10 most wanted list from interpreters when they work with attorneys. So you'll have time to go through that. But let me just go very quickly through this, if you will, this synopsis. So the most basic one is speak to your client directly. So do not say, Miss So-and-so, tell him that. That's standard practice. Now, why do you think that is important? Or that's a basis or a foundation of working with an interpreter?
Helps you to develop a relationship with the person if you're speaking directly to them?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's the purpose of the communication, right? You and your client, exactly. And then, when you work with an interpreter, you have to keep in mind that interpreting and translating is a process and it's difficult. So the simpler sentences you use, the more directly you ask questions or tell things, the more you avoid things that can lead to confusion, like acronyms, idioms, jokes, anything like that. The easier it's going to be for the interpreter to work that out and provide an equivalent. Patience is an important part because no matter you're working with the best interpreter in the universe, the interpretation is going to add time to the process. So if you want to get in and get out, if you have an interpreter, I suggest you add a little time to your appointment. Make sure to clarify any term that the interpreter or the LEP party may not know. And let me give you an example. And I think I had mentioned this to Mariah and Veronica before. Years back, I worked with this attorney at her office, and it was back when the term fresh complaint was still in use. I think now it's been changed to first complaint. And I remember that I approached the attorney at first, and I asked her I told her my understanding of the term to make sure that I was right. And she caught on the fact that it was difficult to translate that because you cannot translate it literally. So she did a fabulous thing. We agreed that when she used that term, I would first relay it in English, and then she would explain it, and then I would interpret the explanation. So it was perfect because there was a transparency about it, and she was sure that I was saying what she expected me to be saying about that term. Now, let's say this first, and then we'll go back and discuss. Understand that court interpreters are not advocates, they're not attorneys, they're not law clerks, they're not administrative staff, they are not cultural consultants for your client and at that moment, or they are not friends of the LEP parties. Now, I said there, let's discuss. So first of all, let me first take this one out of the way. So again, you say, Mr. Chang, you need to be here next Friday, rather than, Madam Interpreter, tell him that. You say, Mr. Interpreter, if you need phone interpreting, I need your help to call Miss Lam to explain to her what will happen, blah, 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 blah. Now, I put in red the verb explain because that is the operative word there. You should never ask an interpreter to explain anything. The interpreter who is professionally trained should turn around and say, Madam Counsel, I'm sorry, but I am not allowed to explain. You can explain, and then I will interpret your explanation. See the difference? Makes sense? All right, so let's look at this scenario. And this is all about the role of the interpreter. You're meeting with your client in your office, your LEP client. This person seems upset and unwilling to address a financial issue with her husband. You want her to address that issue, but there's some problem about it. The interpreter present is from her own country, from the LEP party's country, and you wonder whether this interpreter could help you understand what's going on, could advise you. Is there any cultural issue here? Now, my question to you is, should you ask the interpreter to advise you? Why or why not? Would there be occasions when it would be appropriate? Let's start with that. What would you say?
Well, I would say the majority of the time you should not, because it could be a very individually contingent case, and you could not know all of the circumstances behind what's going on.
The interpreter.
Both the interpreter and you understanding what the client is
okay.
relaying.
So you should not ask the interpreter to advise you on what is happening, okay? That everybody heard her reasoning? which is perfectly on point. Anything else? So just picture the situation. Picture the situation. You're there in your office, you have this interpreter, you may not know much about this interpreter. What do you think? Should you ask the interpreter to tell you what's happening? Mm-hmm.
Even though they might be from the same country, their experiences with, marital relationships or just personal viewpoints might be vastly different about a certain issue. So there's no guarantee that the interpreter will have any special insight into the wife's attitude towards discussing financial matters with her husband.
So what would be the most logical way to find out what is happening to the wife? Ask her. So, and it's funny because for some reason, and Veronica and I have talked about that in the past, there is a tendency, or there can be a tendency for these ad hocs or interpreters who work as volunteers, well, not as volunteers really, they work outside of the court, but mostly in legal service settings, to become like these cultural gurus, no? And I have like different categories that interpreters take on, personas. I call them different things. They are let me see. They're the Mother Teresas, and Mother Teresas can come in male fashion too. They want to solve the problems of all the sick of the world. And then there are the ones who are the complete know-it-all. You use me and I'll solve all your problems. And a lot of people, they need work. So they will want to be on your good side. They will want you to think that they're indispensable. But really, don't forget it. You are the one who is inquiring. You are the one who is in charge of that meeting, no? So for the reasons that both of you have expressed, I think you should always avoid that sort of thing. Any comment? Mm-hmm.
I think you could also even ask directly to the LEP party, are there any cultural reasons as to why it's difficult to talk to me about this financial situation?
Right.
I think you don't necessarily have to be hesitant to ask directly if there is a cultural reason to the client.
Absolutely. But then you maintain that relationship. You see, there's nothing wrong with you going to an interpreter. Let's say in the Spanish, well, probably you know this by now, our official names have our father's surname and our mother's surname. And that sometimes causes problems. When that translates, they turn our father's surname into our middle initial, and the mother's surname becomes the real last name, so that creates a big mess. There's nothing wrong in asking the interpreter for something like that. That's very standard information. But I would, again, invite you to think about this and also think of the possible outcomes. And let me see if I wanted to say this here now or later, because I have my progression of themes here. Hold on. Okay. Well, outcomes. Here's the word. Basically, let's keep in mind that the more you include or bring in the interpreter or open the door for the interpreter to intervene, you're also opening the door for more distance between your client and you. So let me say that at this point, and we'll get back to that. Now, interpreters, when they are professionally trained, have to abide by the Code of Professional Conduct. These are the main elements of the standards of practice for any trained interpreter. Accuracy, impartiality, confidentiality, avoidance of conflict of interest, proficiency, meaning in language, in simultaneous and consecutive interpretation, etc. They know that they may make mistakes and that they have to correct the record. They know that they have to inform the court of any impediment to their performance, and they know that they have to remain within their role. So let's talk a little bit about accuracy, because accuracy is something very special when it comes to court interpreters. Accuracy for interpretation involves not a word-for-word substitution from one language to another. That is not accuracy. I always say this, but translation or interpretation is not about plucking a word out of here and replacing it there. So the interpreter or in the written level, the translator has to come up with ways to convey the message into the other language so that it sounds the same, more or less the same to the listener in the other language. The interpreter captures meaning, captures register, and register refers to the level of formality. So it's not the same to say Mr. Smith than to say hey buddy, no, or hey yo, or whatever. No, it's a different thing. So the interpreter has to capture the form of the message, has to try to capture the intention of the speaker, the tone. We're going to see something in one of the videos about this. And the interpreter cannot simplify, clean up, improve, or embellish. So if you have a client in front of you and the client says something crass about someone or to you, an interpreter who has training should be relating that literally or as literally as possible to you. Even training interpreters have a problem with that one, when it happens in front of the judge especially. So register and completeness. So look at this. For instance, that I underlined treating physician prior to, which are very high register forms of a message. If I were to ask you who was your treating physician in the intervening period prior to your second accident, what would your response be? So, if you're saying that and your sister says, oh, what she's saying is, who was your doctor before, that would be perfectly accurate. But for interpreters in court, it would not be, because the interpreter would have to find a way to somehow convey the formality of the original message, which is not easy. It's not easy. Other challenges that interpreters face in achieving accuracy are all of these elements of speech. Like I said before, some of those don't translate easily. You can add insults there specifically, Those are very difficult to fine-tune so that they express the same thing. So let's look at some of them more in detail. Now, this was prepared for my office, obviously by a Hmong interpreter, who provided this description of the concept of arraignment. And of course, they don't have arraignment in the legal system. So they come up with this picture in words. I still don't know what that means in Hmong. One day I'll have to sit down and really try to see. But like in Spanish, what interpreters do for arraignment is la lectura de cargos, the reading of the charges, because there's not one word. But imagine that. So a person who starts working as an interpreter in court has to take time and put effort into researching and finding ways to develop, their glossary so that they say that as quickly as possible. Even so, usually when the interpreter is still in the first word, the court is already on the fourth paragraph. So it's a challenge. Legalese. I use this slide for my new interpreters when we train them at first. And every single time, the group is convinced that it says that Miss Chan was, what? Raped, obviously, totally. Every single time. So when I tell them what it means, they cannot believe it. And I have to plead with them not to go running out the door, because they think that there's no way I'll never be able to know all of these legalese. Of course, it takes time. Now, again, this is from my intro training. And if you think of interpreters, many of them come from other countries, of course. Many of them were not raised here, of course. Their exposure to English was through books and English classes. They did not live in a place where English was used colloquially. So they have very little understanding of idiomatic expressions. And we have lots of fun with this. because, well, the green monster is famous. Everybody thinks that green monster refers to the god of envy or the god of rage, because they are not even baseball fans. They come from soccer cultures. So they don't even watch, the Red Sox or anything like that. So, and they have a lot of fun with the lazy Susan, because I always tell them that, if you interpret word for word, the people are going to think that there's a woman called Susan who is lazy and who hid a gun in her garment, because they don't know. And so that's why, and wagging the dog was something that happened to one of our interpreters, and she had to, thank God that she knew it was an idiom and transferred it. But what interpreters do is that they communicate meaning, not words. Now again, if you're working with someone who is not a trained interpreter, they may be translating word for word, and that's why sometimes you would see eyes that don't seem to understand anything. The last example, that happened to me once, and the attorney asked something, were you upset? And I had to go and, I had to raise my hand and ask for clarification. I said, counsel, does counsel mean, or the interpreter needs to inquire from counsel whether he means angry or nervous or whatever, because those are words that are ambiguous. Now, a good interpreter is going to seek clarification. A person who has no training may just roll over and, who knows. Now, false cognates, the false friends, false amis. Now, those are very tricky also. And let me just say that you are probably working with some heritage speakers as interpreters. So people, let's say I'm going to use Spanish because it's the one that I, of course, know better. A Spanish speaker who grows here in the state maybe has never taken a Spanish class, or maybe has taken just a few years, but is not really conversant with the grammar of the language and just speaks at home. They don't necessarily know when they are dealing with a false cognate. So molestar sounds like molest. It must mean the same. Or disgust means, disgusto means disgust. Simpática means sympathetic. There you go. Well, no, not really. So, ese día mi hermano nos había estado molestando toda la noche o toda la mañana. That day, my brother had been not molesting us, but either teasing us or pestering us or bothering us. Now, that's a humongous difference that can cause a lot of trouble for a defendant. Now, a pesar de su disgusto, Elena fue simpática con sus suegros durante la cena. Despite not her disgust, but her anger, Elena was not sympathetic, but friendly towards her in-laws during dinner. So see, it's tricky, you have to really understand the language. So basically, professionally trained interpreters should clarify when they have doubt. They should correct errors when they find out that they made them or somebody else points it out, and everything else that we already discussed. And also, they should inform the LEP parties and the English-speaking parties of their standards and let you know that they're saying that in their own language. Now, let me just stop for a second and hope that you're a bit more warmed up. Is there anything that has popped in your mind at this point? Any situation you have experienced? If so, what happened? How did you solve it? Has anybody? Mm-hmm.
So I got the sense in working, this was a divorce case, I got the sense in working with an interpreter that he was not very sympathetic towards my client. I didn't know, whether I was misreading it or whether he really had a bias. And I attributed, maybe my paranoia or the bias to just some cultural, norms that I perhaps, just guessed were at issue. And I wondered my solution was to request another interpreter, if not just for my own ease and peace of mind.
Can I ask you to describe what made you feel uneasy?
So it was a divorce case, as I mentioned, and it's hard to pinpoint, really. It wasn't a trust. There was a distrust, I think, on my part, and I can't really pinpoint, why it is that I felt that way.
Was that the first time that you worked with this interpreter?
I'd worked with him a couple of times.
And had you had that same impression?
Right.
Okay, but see, you had that little light flashing in there. And in the midst of the meeting, did you say something? Did you ask the interpreter anything, or you left it untouched at that point?
I'm not sure I know what you mean. Ask him.
So when you were feeling or sensing something, did you ever feel that the interpreter was saying something inappropriate to the LEP party without you knowing?
No, I don't think I ever felt that way.
Did you sense that the interpreter was not interpreting fully?
I wouldn't know. I don't know.
Did you sense that the LEP party felt the same way as you did?
That I did.
Okay,
yes.
See? That came out very clearly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how did the person manifest the uneasiness?
So, my client and I would talk, and we had also dealt with another interpreter, and she also, she expressed a preference for the other interpreter.
Mm-hmm.
And it could very well be because maybe the other interpreter was maybe too sympathetic and too, supportive.
Mother Teresa.
Yeah, we like the Mother Teresa much better than maybe the professional.
That's a grouch. Uh-huh. Okay. No, but see, it's interesting that you had that sense, and I think you did the right thing in not working with this interpreter until you had more information about that person. Is that person someone who has any training that you know of?
I'm sure they do. Yeah, and again, I don't want to, get them into any trouble. It was just an uneasiness. And again, it could have just been, a figment of my imagination. But.
Okay. And one last question, because it's important to something that we are going to hear later. Did you ever think of maybe later sitting down with the interpreter and addressing this directly?
Nope. Never occurred to me to do.
Do you think you should have? I'm really making
busy.
her sweat here.
No.
You wouldn't, okay.
No.
Okay. Would anyone, I don't know, think that if that happened to you, you would like to ask the interpreter directly? Mm-hmm.
I had a similar experience where I was working with a client who spoke French and I speak Spanish. So while they're obviously not at all the same language, I could follow the conversation enough to know more or less what was happening, and could tell that the interpreter was, for one thing, adding in comments that I was not making, and for another, not translating comments that the client was making to me. And I actually stopped the meeting. It was just a divorce client as well, a meeting in my office, and spoke with the interpreter out in the hallway to explain what my expectations were and what I felt the interpreter should be doing and wasn't doing, and then took that as a learning experience. Thereafter, whenever I work with an interpreter, I now start my meeting with a little bit of a let's chat interpreter, make sure we're on the same page. This is what I expect. Please let me know if you don't understand what's happening or need a clarification. But I did find it helpful to have that conversation with the interpreter and explain, it was a situation where she didn't want to translate what the client was saying because it was a bit embarrassing for the client, which I respect that the interpreter was trying to protect her privacy, but she's meeting with her attorney to get a divorce. It's going to go into private matters, and I need to know what she's saying so that I can figure out the best way to get this woman divorced. So, once I explained that with the interpreter, I felt like the meeting then went much better thereafter.
So that was a successful intervention from your part.
Well, in my opinion, but I'm obviously very biased. So I don't know if the interpreter and client felt the same way.
But it's interesting that imagine if you had not understood the little bit that you did, that would have been happening under your nose and you would never have known.
And that's why I now start, because it was with a client who speaks French, and so I was kind of familiar with French. But for clients who speak, an Asian language where it bears no resemblance to anything that I speak, I'm totally clueless as to what's happening. So that's why I now, with any interpreter, just start out the meeting kind of having that dialogue, hoping that it then prevents the problems from happening, but I have no idea. That's part of the problem.
And that's like textbook what is there in the handouts in terms of how you all can set up the scene at first. If the interpreter doesn't do it, thank you. If the interpreter doesn't do it, then you certainly should do it. Now, all right, excellent, because I think we're going to address now these two folks here, confidentiality and impartiality. And let's start with impartiality. And let me show you a little piece of a video here. And then we can talk.
Our next dramatic scenario deals with the issue of maintaining impartiality. Often an interpreter is put at risk of compromising
We need volume.
impartiality. In the scenario you're about.
Do we need volume here? This one is all the way up.
Yeah, I think it's not connected.
Scenario deals with the issue of maintaining impartiality. Often an interpreter is put at risk of compromising their professional impartiality. In the scenario you're about to watch, the interpreter is threatened by his employer to break that aspect of professionalism. And then, in a follow-up scene, the client tries to take advantage of the interpreter's cultural association.
Mr. Interpreter, may I speak with you for a moment before you leave?
Yes, of course.
It's about this client. What's your take on her? Is she credible? Is she telling the truth? Or do you think she could be holding something back?
I'm sorry, but that's not my area of expertise. I wouldn't be able to say.
Sure, but you're both from the same country. You must have some idea what she's really like, right? I mean, it doesn't take an expert to understand somebody from your own country.
My mandate is to interpret everything that is said by each person, not what I may think they really mean. And that's all I'm allowed to do.
Yeah, but surely you must have some impression.
I must remain neutral to all parties at all times.
Not while I'm paying you. I've hired you to work for me, and you'll do things my way, or you won't be hired by my office again.
I'm sorry I cannot help you. I will be sending you an invoice for this afternoon interpreting services. Now, if you will excuse me.
Señor intérprete, ¿le puedo preguntar algo?
Sí, por supuesto.
¿Cómo ve usted mi caso? ¿Cómo me va? Ese señor, el fiscal, ¿me cree?
Lo siento, señora Benavides, pero realmente no me es permitido hablar de su caso con usted.
Pero entre nosotros, no se lo voy a decir a nadie. Nomás necesito saber qué opina usted. O sea, usted sabe cómo son las cosas aquí. Me va bien. Puedo hacer algo para mejorar mis posibilidades.
Señora Benavides, realmente no es cuestión de que pueda o no pueda yo hablar de su caso con usted. Realmente no tengo idea de cómo le va. Sería muy peligroso tratar de darle algún consejo o alguna opinión. ¿Qué pasa si estoy mal informado?
Le puedo pagar. No hay por qué lo sepa nadie. Es nomás entre nosotros, como amigos, como compatriotas.
Lo siento, señora Benavides, pero no en lo absoluto. Ya me están pagando y si me disculpa me tengo que ir.
¿Entonces no me ayuda?
Mire, se supone que estoy en mi descanso para que al poder regresar pueda desarrollar mi trabajo bien. Busquemos a su abogado. Él es la persona que puede darle consejos, contestar sus preguntas. Para eso está él. Yo estaré encantado de ser su intérprete y ayudarle. Para eso estoy yo. Acompáñame, buscamos por aquí.
All right. So, the attorney could not sway the interpreter's resolution to be impartial at all times. And you know, these things, of course, this is a training video for interpreters, but believe me, this sort of thing happens more than you think. So keep an eye on that. And here's one that I think is especially important for you to know. We have addressed this scenario. The list on the right represents some of the languages that in my office in the trial court we have been experiencing lately. These are new languages from new immigrants to Massachusetts. In these communities, usually everybody who speaks the language knows each other. They go to the same church together. And there is a huge issue of confidentiality. So if you ever deal with a client in one of these language groups, be mindful of that. Maybe set up, make sure that you're addressing the issue of confidentiality, that something cannot be discussed once they leave your office. And find out from your client maybe if there's a discomfort from they hearing, someone from the community hearing about what they are, the dirty laundry. So again, to round it up, interpreters should never be asked to express personal comments on an LEP party's truthfulness or honesty. Never. That is a no-no ever. And if an interpreter cannot understand the LEP party's speech or a term or expression, the interpreter should ask for clarification as the speaker, and especially you, the person conducting the meeting. So in other words, the interpreter should not get involved in a private conversation explaining or clarifying without you knowing. If that were to happen, we'll see what we can do. Now, so the grand finale to this first part is any bilingual person qualified to work as a court interpreter? And obviously, I hope that I have been able to convey that the answer is no. And it's the court interpreter's role to make sure that the LEP parties understand their court or legal process. Well, I hope that I have been able to convey that no, that the court interpreter's role is to ensure linguistic access. It's not their role to ensure LEP parties' understanding. It is their role to make sure that the person hears everything and that the interpreter communicates, the LEP party communicates effectively with the court or the legal system. Now, food for thought. What are, if any, the dangers of using a family member or another non-professional as an interpreter? And I have used the word danger for dramatic effect, but you can certainly substitute it by, possible outcomes, problems, etc. And I'm sure you can be thinking about them already. So, first of all, let's set this on the table. Please avoid using children. There have been many cases in which children have been used with very negative consequences. Never use members of your client's family who may have vested interests, or even someone from the other side of the case. Believe it or not, in court, cases have been recorded where the alleged abuser in a 209A case has been used as an interpreter. So, again, I wish I were just inventing all this. Watch out for these rogue interpreters who they benefit from people of the community and they never tell them that they're interpreters in court or they're real interpreters, and they encourage the person to use their services, and they keep charging and charging and charging. If you have a form that your LEP party needs to sign, be careful if your assistant interpreter or the ad hoc interpreter is too willing to help the person fill it out, because there could be issues about that later on. This makes sense? Okay. Anything else that you can think about? Of course, with no, let's go. Let's keep going. Now, let's say, yes.
I was once helping at lawyer for the day in probate court, and a couple came in together to get divorced, and he did not speak English, and she did. He spoke Spanish, and I can speak Spanish. I wasn't in a position to explain the legal process in Spanish, so we explained it to them in English, and she told him what we were saying in Spanish, even though they were the two parties for the divorce. And it made me uncomfortable that she was the one telling him, but I also knew enough Spanish to know that she was telling him what I said, and she was telling him appropriate things. She was translating correctly. So I never felt uncomfortable enough to stop the interview, but what would you do in that sort of situation? I mean, should we not have gone ahead with advising them if they were technically would have been on either sides of the divorce?
Anybody has any comment to that? Anybody wants to chip in? Because what I would tell you is what I told your colleague. What if you had not understood Spanish? And what if the person chose to omit certain things from the explanation? You would never have known. So again, in the ideal world, ideally, I would say avoid that. Except for very short things that you can, you guys need to be here next week or whatever. That's what I would say.
Even if you understand?
Well, if you understand and it's something simple, you're describing a process or something, and you have no interpreter at hand, well, then you make that decision. But be careful if you don't understand what they're saying, because you don't know. That was in court?
It was an office in the courthouse.
Because there's usually a Spanish interpreter somewhere. So keep that in mind as well. Okay. I'm glad that you understood what she was saying.
Me too.
So basically what we were saying earlier, check if you use an ad hoc interpreter in your office, and now we are stepping down from the court. We are back in your offices. We are using the people that are being used there. We don't know their level of training. So you can make sure that they are familiar with the concepts. That's my comment on fresh complaint. Monitor the ethical standards. So what, I'm sorry, your name was?
Donna.
What Donna was saying, that she then resorted to establishing the parameters of what she was expecting, encourage them to clarify, and make sure the interpreter is interpreting. I mean, has anybody been in a situation where you're talking or the person is speaking and blah, 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 blah comes back as one word? So if that is happening, certainly you should intervene and ask what's happening, no? So monitor the interpreter's performance. And I mean, should you say something at that point? You should, definitely. And you can do it in a way that is respectful. Now, this is a typical one. You notice the interpreter chatting with the LEP party in their own language, and you don't know what's going on. See, and if I were you, I would certainly intervene and make sure that that doesn't happen because there's too much at stake, obviously. Now, let's watch this one. I think you're going to like this one a lot. Okay. Oops, sorry about that.
So what do you think Luis would say happened to his eye?
Entonces, ¿qué piensa que diría Luis que pasó con el ojo de él?
Pues yo me imagino que él le dirá que unos chamacos lo golpearon.
Well, I figure that he'd tell you that some young men hit him in the eye.
Well, I've actually talked to Luis at his school, and he said that you came home drunk on Sunday and you hit him.
Bueno, hablé con Luis en la escuela y él dijo que usted había llegado emborrachado el domingo en la noche y que le había pegado.
Eso es imposible porque yo estuve trabajando el domingo en Charlie.
¿Dónde trabaja?
O Charlie's.
Sí, ¿qué es Charlie's?
Es el restaurante donde yo trabajo.
That's impossible. I was at work at Charlie's that night.
Okay, what else was he saying?
Oh, he just said, I didn't understand what he was saying when he said, oh, Charlie's, so I was just asking about that.
Okay. What do you think Luis would say happened to his eye?
¿Qué piensa que dirá Luis que pasó con el ojo de él?
Pues yo me imagino que le dirá que unos chamacos lo golpearon.
I would imagine that he would tell you that some young man hit him.
Well, I've actually talked to Luis at his school, and he said that you came home drunk Sunday and hit him.
Bueno, hablé con Luis en la escuela de él y él me había comentado que usted llegó emborrachado el domingo por la noche y que le había pegado.
Eso es imposible porque yo el domingo yo estuve trabajando en Charlie.
As an interpreter, I need to clarify a word used.
Okay.
¿Dónde trabaja, señor?
En O'Charlie's.
That's impossible because I was at work on Sunday night at O'Charlie's.
Okay.
Interpreting sessions will not always go smoothly. You may encounter difficult accents, unknown regional slang, or individuals who mumble or speak quickly. Never engage in a clarifying conversation that excludes the other party. Appropriate clarifying will create less disruption and provide for a better flow during the session. It will also prevent the exclusion of one party from the conversation.
Well, if you didn't hit Luis, why would he tell me that you did?
Entonces, si usted no le pegó a Luis, ¿por qué dijo él que se lo pegó?
Mira, Luis se pasa mintiendo siempre, todo el tiempo, diciendo mentiras. Yo creo que se debe a que cuando él era pequeño y cuando él nació, él tuvo problemas de respiración y no respiraba bien, y yo creo que eso le causó problemas en el cerebro. Él siempre se pasa mintiendo, y lo hemos agarrado varias veces mintiendo en muchas cosas. Y le puedes preguntar a los hermanos de él, siempre mintiendo. Lo hemos agarrado muchas veces.
Luis likes to lie a lot.
Is that all he just said?
I mean, pretty much.
So if you didn't hit Luis, why would he say that you did?
Entonces, si usted no le pegó a Luis, ¿por qué dijo él de que sí le pegó?
Bueno, Luis se pasa mintiendo todo el tiempo. Él miente. Yo creo que se debe a que cuando él era chico, cuando nació,
Well, the thing about it is that Luis likes to lie a lot. He lies and lies. I think it has something to do with when he was born.
cuando nació, él tuvo problemas de respiración. Yo creo que eso le hizo daño en el cerebro.
He had some breathing problems, and I think that damaged his brain.
Y él siempre se pasa mintiendo. Nosotros lo hemos agarrado varias veces mintiendo. Y si quiere, le puede preguntar a los hermanos.
And I think that's why he lies a lot. We've actually caught him in quite a few lies. You could even ask his brothers about that.
Él siempre está mintiendo.
He's always lying.
Well, here's the thing. I actually did talk to his brothers yesterday, and they told me the same thing that he said.
Bueno, sí hablé con los hermanos de él y ellos me comentaron lo mismo de lo que él había dicho.
Most people realize that an interpreter needs pauses in conversation to interpret. Unfortunately, some people will continue to talk without giving time to interpret the message. In such cases, an interpreter should feel free to interject in the conversation to ask the individual to pause and allow room for interpretation. This management of the session will create greater flow and reduce the need to summarize parts of the message.
Okay, I actually talked to all of your children, and they all told me the same story, that you hit Luis.
Bueno, hablé con todos sus hijos y ellos me contaron el mismo cuento de que usted sí le pegó a Luis.
Oh, sí. Yo le pegué a un niño de 5 años.
Yes, I hit a 5-year-old.
So you admit that you hit him?
Entonces está confesando que sí lo pegó.
No, yo no le pegué a él.
No, I didn't hit him.
Then why did you just say you hit him?
¿Y por qué dijo que le pegó?
Estoy siendo sarcástico. ¿Cómo tú te atreves a ir a hablar con mis niños sin yo estar presente? Pedazo de basura.
I was being sarcastic. Why did you talk to my kids without me there?
Well, I'm allowed to talk to your children at school. That's part of the law.
Yo tengo el derecho de hablar con sus hijos en la escuela, es parte de las leyes.
But listen, well, here's what we need to get down to. You need to start telling the truth right now. No more lies.
Usted necesita decir la verdad, señor.
I've actually talked to all of your children at school, and they all told me the same story that you hit Luis.
Bueno, en la actualidad hablé con todos sus hijos en la escuela y ellos me contaron el mismo cuento de que usted le había pegado a Luis.
Entonces, yo le pegué a un niño de 5 años.
So I hit a 5-year-old.
I don't know, you tell me.
Yo no sé, usted me necesita decir.
Mira, ¿cómo tú te pones a hablar con mis niños sin yo estar presente? Pedazo de basura.
How in the world do you think you could go and talk to my kids without me being present, you piece of trash?
Okay, listen. You need to start telling the truth right now, and you need to stop all the lies.
Ahora, escucha, señor, usted necesita decir la verdad ahorita sin mentir.
Ok, yo le pegué, yo estaba borracho, en realidad yo no me acuerdo de nada.
Okay, I hit him, but I was drunk and I really don't remember a lot of it.
Words are only part of what is being said. Professional interpreters replicate the register, style, and tone of the speaker. This will prevent confusion, ensure an accurate and clear message, and instill confidence in both parties that what they are saying is truly being conveyed. These 7 tips demonstrate some of the core differences between a trained and untrained interpreter.
So what did you think? Did that illustrate what we've been talking? You know, when I see that woman, the actress that portrays the interpreter, I cringe, because any interpreter should carry a notepad. And let me just step out of the office and go back to the court for a second. You know, professional interpreter who doesn't carry a notepad, that in itself is a red light, because that's how you as an interpreter, besides your memory, you make notes to guide you and to refresh your memory so that you can retrieve all that information. That's how interpreters at the witness stand, they can preserve long paragraphs, otherwise, or segments. That's, you know, otherwise it's almost impossible. But you know, it brings home the notion that the person conducting the meeting should intervene whenever something is not looking right, no? And speaking of which, about what we were saying about setting the scene, let's talk a little bit about seating arrangement, because last time I went to the volunteers lawyers project, I was asking Veronica to show me some of the rooms, and you know, the seating arrangement has also a lot to do. And if you look at the different pictures, I don't know if I can point this thing here. Oh, you won't see it. Okay. So the one, you know, there are different ways in which you can make sure, or the interpreter can make sure, that the direct communication is between you and the LEP party. And the most basic one, if it's a one-on-one, is that the interpreter sits next to the LEP party, but a little behind, so that, you know, if you see an interpreter taking central stage, that's a sign, because it's not about the interpreter. So it is a way to kind of signify that direct communication. When there are more than one parties, there's more, you know, there are a group of people around the table, then it depends. If only one person needs the interpreter, then the interpreter should be placed in a way that can reach the two parties at the same time, so that the interpreter can do simultaneous while any discussion is happening. But again, basically what I want to maybe emphasize here is, if you notice that the interpreter is taking central stage, that should not happen. So if nothing comes out of the interpreter, if I were you, I would feel, you know, empowered to say, Madam Interpreter, can you maybe move or sit a little back or whatever. But just keep that in mind. Any question about that? Anything happen there? Because I have seen interpreters also not managing that very well, and they are way away from the party, so they have to shout, and they're interrupting all the time. So you have to see an interpreter who has that, I don't know, that ability to find a way to be as unintrusive, and as effective as possible. That should be a good sign. Now, finally, I know that you rely a lot on phone interpreting. Can you tell me a little bit about your experiences doing phone interpreting? Does it work well? Have you had problems? It's generally not comfortable, no? Mm-hmm.
I had a client who we would do the three-way with the interpreter on her cell phone, me in my office and then the client, and it got to the point where my office mates speak Spanish, and sometimes I would just ask her to call if it was just, setting up a meeting time or, asking her to bring a document to a meeting or something, because there was always something wrong with the cell phone and the reception, and then if it wasn't a planned phone call, we couldn't always get everybody on the phone, so it's a mess.
And Veronica had mentioned that already. And, that is fine because it's just, making an appointment.
Right.
But do you think the fact the interpreter was on the cell phone played a role in it becoming difficult?
I mean, sometimes she would literally be in her car and have to pull over so she could stop and help us. So we actually stopped doing it for the most part.
Yeah, that's very difficult. Most of the time, do you have the interpreter in your same area, or it's like with her, a three-way?
Yeah, I've had similar experiences, but mine is also, I usually use like a language line or something. I'm calling in, they're calling the client, and then we're on 3 different phone calls, and it sometimes gets kind of disjointed if there's some sort of phone issue, but also just if the interpreter has to clarify something, they have no background. They don't have any background in the topic, so they don't know what they should and shouldn't be clarifying.
Which the thing with language line is that you could have an interpreter anywhere in the country, which is a big thing. So we'll talk about that. And you were going to say?
Oh, I've just seen it go poorly on the phone.
Well, let me just mention this. Even professionally trained interpreters hate phone interpreting because it's very disconcerting. I mean, you don't have the cues, you don't have the good context. It's difficult. It's intimidating. I don't know. How would I say? Talking on the phone in a language that is not your native language is very intimidating for anyone. And the thing is, it can be intimidating for the interpreter working, with you there to start with. So that's why, and you have a handout, or actually, the last page of your handout, which is something from the federal court that you can certainly use as a guideline and apply to your situation. It's from the Department of Justice. And see how it makes the recommendations that you... Where is it? Where is it? Well, it says on the right to talk directly to the LEP individual. We talked about that. If possible, get the people's number, so if the call is lost, that you have it, that you pause after 1 or 2 sentences, ask one question, and you speak clearly and in a normal space. But I would go further than that. I would, let me see. I would, using the cell phones, it's going to always be a problem. So whenever possible, request landlines. Take time at the beginning to introduce all parties and to clarify the role of the interpreter. That's very important. Control the flow of communication by pacing yourself, going slow, speaking clearly. Give the interpreter a summary of the issues to be addressed. If you could just have a quick conversation with the interpreter first. And make sure to explain or describe references to local sites or events. Sometimes, we are so used to saying, oh, Mass Ave, blah, 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 the incident that happened when you were living in blah, 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 or Haverhill or whatever, and things that we take for granted. But some of the interpreters that are doing phone interpreting are not from here. So don't expect, you have to be a detective. You have to think beforehand of any roadblock and take a moment and explain that to the interpreter. You were going to say?
I just had a question. So we ran into the problem a few times where we wouldn't get the client, we would get her voicemail. And we would not have prepared like what kind of message to leave. So we would have to like wait for the voicemail to run out, delete it, and then start over.
Gosh.
So I don't know if you have any advice for, is it...
Well, can you discuss that with your client and kind of say, we are going to... That was an impromptu call. It was not a call that was... Mm-hmm.
Like if there wasn't a call that was planned, or if it was a call that was planned and she just wasn't able to pick up the phone. So we learned that the hard way the first couple
of
times.
Those are...
It was very awkward.
Very hard. No. That's why interpreters hate it. Would it be...
Is it appropriate to talk to the interpreter beforehand and say, if in the case we don't get the person,
yes,
can you leave the following? Okay.
You could, but give the interpreter the script, basically. Mm-hmm. Okay. That would be good. And if the person is going to call the interpreter, be careful.
I would usually have her call me.
Mm-hmm.
She could understand enough that I could say, hold on, and I'll call the interpreter. But then you get into like a phone tag with 3 people.
Yeah, no, it's problematic, to say the least. Anybody else wants to share any solution to your interpreter qualms over the phone? I have to tell you, and when I first came to the United States to go to my graduate program, in Puerto Rico, I had learned English since I was a kid, and I had been for many years in an American school, and all my textbooks were in English, and I had the bombardment that we have in Puerto Rico of everything American, the language and everything. So I came here and I felt, but I had never had to call a phone company in English. And I remember that I was so terrified because already I trying to talk to the cabbies terrified me because they never understood me, and I didn't understand them, and I felt like an idiot. So exponentially, talking on the phone was like 10 million times more. I used to write what I was going to say before I called the phone company, and I cannot tell you how, it took years before I felt that I didn't have to think ahead of time before I picked up the phone in English. So don't underestimate how intimidating it could be. The more information you provide, the calmer the whole situation is, the easier it's going to be for everyone. I have maybe, let me see, one more thing before we said goodbye. So this is the handout. That's Puerto Rico, by the way. Dreaming. So let me ask you something. Has anything that I said here been helpful for you? Do you find that you're thinking about things now? Any question that you think was not addressed? We have, I think, 12 minutes, 15 minutes. Mm-hmm.
So it's going back to Dee's question earlier. I think a lot of my personal practice is in the probate court, not in a courtroom, but working with clinics or lawyer for the day, or people who are just kind of wandering into court and need help. And quite often they have with them a family member who is an opposing party with them to help translate, or they have with them no one at all. And I was wondering if you had a suggestion. The court interpreters are not available to help these people. They just, that's not their role. They work in the courtrooms. They aren't in the clerk's office. So how would you suggest dealing with when a client comes to a clinic or comes to the lawyer for the day and says, I need help and here's someone to interpret for me, but this person happens to be the husband in the divorce that we're seeking, or the parent in a guardianship, or what have you?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that the interpreters that are assigned to the trial court, they are not just for the courtroom. Interpreters are there for the court. And which court is that, for instance?
Mostly Suffolk Probate and Family Court.
Brooke. So we have an office there, interpreter's office, and there's usually, let's say, well, there are always Spanish interpreters there. And you can certainly find, ask the clerk if they can call to get you an interpreter. You can do that.
Really?
Yes. What? You're going to say that didn't happen?
So A couple things. One is if you're there on a VLP clinic, we do have a telephone interpreter contract, so you can use the telephone, and we've had to do that a few times.
Okay.
Keep it brief. The second is that we are starting a pilot with Suffolk. So the view is that they really don't have the capacity to provide interpreters for the Attorney for the Day program or our clinic in the hallway. That we're trying to set up a program where the clerk's office will call an interpreter to help with the clerk's office, with the filing, with the questions, with the scheduling. But the position of your office, which is reasonable, is that there aren't enough interpreters to be helping volunteers in the hallway.
Well, it's not really what it is a matter of priorities and resources. If the interpreters are sitting there, someone will come, for sure. Now, if there's nobody to come to you, I would say you will have to gauge that case by case. If it's something sensitive and you're not understanding what the person is saying, I would just keep it to a minimum and maybe have them come back and see if the court can have an interpreter assigned for the next time, honestly. Because you don't know.
Right.
That's the problem. And don't get me wrong, and I'm not going to get into the Office of Court Interpreter Services now, but the truth of the matter is that there are not enough language access resource services yet. They're not, period. And we do the best we can. We cover an enormous amount considering the resources available. But we need to keep expanding that. There should be a point when you guys have access to communicate when you need it. So hopefully, maybe, I don't know, one day we'll get there. But in the meantime, just keep in mind, when you are working with someone, again, to make it more meaningful, have these things that we discuss here today as guidelines. And if it's not working for you, change it. If you go to the website of the Office of Court Interpreter Services, there's an online list of all our interpreters, or most of our interpreters. And they are there. You can contract the services if you were in the position to do it, of course. But if you need something for a sensitive case and you need a professional interpreter, that's a way to find one. Okay?
I was going to just mention, with VLP cases, we do provide interpreters with the case. Some of those interpreters are court certified or qualified, but there are many, many who aren't. And so it's really important to learn these things so you do have the red flags. We are working on trying to train the interpreters that we use and put quality assurance things in place, but I will say that there is always room for improvement in that area, and so it is really important that you're empowered to take control of the situation, whether it be seating. There's many interpreters that we do contract with that may not have learned the proper seating for an interpreter because they're a bilingual speaker who's been interpreting for a long time but never been trained. So we are working now on trying to train our interpreters more, but it's a slow process.
And we're always open to feedback. So if you have a really good or really bad experience, let us know, because then we use the people who've had good experiences more and decrease our use of bad interpreters. So we're always working on that list. We're always recruiting, and we're always trying to improve quality.
And it's a good idea to learn about the interpreter, to know them, what is their background, what training have they had, encourage them to go and seek some help. I mean, even in YouTube, that first video that I showed you, there is a whole series of that ethics training. And so, if an interpreter tells you that he or she is going to give a ride to the person that they're interpreting for, that should be a big red flag that this person, no. And so, so over willingness to be your pal or to give you all kinds of information, so beware. Anything else? I was going to do an exercise, but I don't think we have time, so I was going to torture you with, we have? Okay. Would you be fair game to do a little exercise that we do for interpreters so that you get a sense of how difficult it is to do interpretation? Can I interest you? Okay, let me see. But I need to get out of here. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay.
I feel prisoner in that thing. Okay.
All right. So I told told Mariah and Veronica, it would be fun to have the attorneys experience a little bit of what it is to be an interpreter. The room doesn't lend itself, but we'll figure it out. Okay, here's the thing. Simultaneous interpretation, no? That's when the interpreter is whispering. That's very difficult, and it takes the ability to do dual tasking, because you're listening and you're processing and you're speaking at the same time, and while you're speaking, you're listening for the next one. So at the end of the day, the interpreter's head is like mush. So when in interpreting courses or programs, they do an exercise that is called shadowing, and then it's upped a volume to turn it into a dual task. Now, do you all have something to write in front of you? Okay, here's the thing. I am going to maybe work with these three tables first, and then I'll go to you guys. And basically what I'm going to ask you to do, you're looking at me here, is to shadow me. So to repeat verbatim, like my echo, what I'm saying in English. Okay? So for instance, I don't know, Veronica, can you read anything and I'll shadow you to illustrate? Read anything.
The following suggestions are made by the Interpreter's Office of the Southern District of New York in the spirit of aiding communication.
See? I was her echo. I was her echo. I'll go slow. But you have to do it, because then when we do the dual task, then it's going to make sense. Ready?
Do you want us to speak it or write it?
Speak it. Right now. The writing is from later. Thank you. Okay, the first group. Ready? In 2008, a Chinese restaurant displayed a bilingual sign above its storefront to accommodate English-speaking patrons. To save a few pennies in creating the sign, someone for the restaurant skipped use of a professional human translation. Instead, the restaurateur typed the restaurant name into a machine translation program, which quickly returned some English text that was printed and placed above the business storefront without review. How did that go?
That's worse than the
Okay. Now, okay. So the same. I'm just going to read that, and you guys are just going to repeat verbatim. Okay? Just shadow. Ready? Public interest in machine translation is growing as the nature of business becomes increasingly international. Translation technology continues to improve, and Google makes news each time it adds machine translation features to another of its online applications. With increased interest comes increased optimism. However, it is important to question whether this optimism is based on reality or hype. Excellent. Okay. Now let's do the dual task. Now, this first group, you're going to shadow me again. But as you shadow me orally, you're going to write numerals. You're going to start with 1 and go up. So the numeral 1, 2, 3, 4, as you shadow. So the trick of the exercise is that you do it at the same time. I'll go slow. If you skip numbers, don't worry. Catch it right back and keep going. And later I'll ask you something about your experience, okay? This is not about perfection. It's about what happens in your head when you're doing that. Ready? Ready as you're going to be, right? All right. Consumers' optimism about machine translation often cools when they notice glaring errors in machine-translated communication. Some of these anecdotes are rather humorous, like the incident involving the Chinese restaurant sign. Earlier this year, the online periodical Kazakhstan Today was unable to convey its intended meaning through a machine-translated English article without producing What happened?
Next, you're going to make us do this.
You can barely do this. I could never do that.
So before, I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask you the following question. What turned out to be the dominant task? Hearing, repeating, or writing? So think about that. You ready? So again, as you shadow, you start writing. One, two, three, and
I got to look at skipping that, and I couldn't write that right.
Okay. Ready? Is machine translation one? No. Automatic translation is neither completely worthless nor worthless. However, in very specific situations, machine translations can be quite useful and beneficial. For example, when users merely need to understand the gist of the document, machine translation can provide low-quality translation much faster and much more cost-effectively than human ever could. Wow.
I started blanking on my numbers.
So, very quickly. Now, the reason for this exercise is that helps the person start developing the ability to do two tasks at the same time. And then it leads to the skill of interpreting. And then this dual task, the next level is rather than 1, 2, 3, is 2, 4, 6, 8, or 20, 19, going down, or writing words as you shadow. And the more you do that, the more the interpreter can develop that engine. Now, was this easy? No. And this is without interpreting. Now, imagine adding interpreting to this. So I just wanted you to get a taste. By the way, which task became more automatic, the writing or the speaking? Writing? Okay, good. Because usually, the understanding is the dominant task for most people. So now you know. And because we are out of time, I was going to do a consecutive one, but I'll spare you that. Thank you. Okay, thank you guys.
I want her for my training.
Yeah.